March 15, 2018. A crisp spring morning brought an unusual crowd to the Morrison Street Gallery, a modest art space in the city's Pearl District. The gallery owner, Catherine Hayes, had spent 23 years in the art world, curating exhibitions for emerging and established artists alike. She prided herself on recognizing talent, on understanding the stories behind each brushstroke and composition. But nothing in her extensive experience had prepared her for what she discovered that Thursday morning. The exhibition opening the previous evening had been a modest success. Local art enthusiasts had wandered through the gallery, wine glasses in hand, admiring a collection of landscapes and urban scenes. The paintings possessed an unusual quality, a depth and precision that seemed almost photographic. Rich textures captured the interplay of light and shadow across Portland's bridges, the weathered facades of historic buildings, the dense canopy of Forest Park. Several pieces had already sold, red dots marking them as claimed. "So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from." Catherine had met the artist briefly during setup. Matthew Collins, 58 years old, had navigated the gallery space with careful, measured steps, his white cane tapping a rhythm against the hardwood floors. He had lost his vision completely 5 years earlier, he explained, yet somehow continued to create art that defied every conventional understanding of the visual medium. The morning after the opening, Catherine arrived early to begin cataloging sales and preparing shipping arrangements. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows as she moved from painting to painting, updating her inventory records. One piece in particular held her attention longer than the others. It depicted a narrow alley between two brick buildings, trash bins lined against weathered walls, a single streetlight casting long shadows across cracked pavement. Something about the scene triggered a memory. Catherine pulled out her phone and searched local news archives, scrolling through headlines from the past decade. When she found what she was looking for, her breath caught. The painting matched, with disturbing accuracy, the location where a young woman named Amanda Peterson had last been seen 3 years earlier. The case remained unsolved. The investigation stalled without witnesses or substantial leads. Catherine examined other paintings more carefully. Another showed the interior of what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse, wooden crates stacked against concrete walls, a single window high above casting a rectangle of light across the dusty floor. A third depicted a residential street she didn't immediately recognize, but something about the specific arrangement of houses, the particular curve of the road, suggested this wasn't merely an artistic interpretation of a generic neighborhood. She spent the next several hours researching, cross-referencing the paintings with news reports and missing persons cases. The connections were impossible to ignore. Each painting seemed to correspond to a location tied to an unsolved disappearance in the Portland area over the past decade. But what made Catherine's hands shake as she made notes wasn't simply the locations themselves. It was the details, the specific elements that shouldn't have been possible for anyone to know, let alone a man who had been blind for 5 years. The warehouse painting included details that matched crime scene photographs Catherine managed to locate through careful internet searches and archived news coverage. The positioning of certain objects, the specific graffiti on the walls, details that had never been publicly released. The alley where Amanda Peterson disappeared showed a broken section of chain-link fence that investigative reports had mentioned, but news coverage had omitted. Catherine called Matthew Collins that afternoon. His phone rang 6 times before he answered, his voice cautious and slightly confused about why the gallery owner needed to speak with him so urgently. She asked him to come to the gallery the following morning, insisting it was important they discuss his work in more detail. He agreed, though she could hear the hesitation in his voice. That evening, Catherine couldn't sleep. She kept returning to the paintings in her mind, trying to rationalize what seemed impossible to explain. Matthew Collins had been completely blind for 5 years. The crimes depicted in his paintings had occurred within that time frame, places and scenes he couldn't have witnessed. Yet somehow, his canvases captured details that shouldn't have been accessible to him, elements that suggested either an incredible coincidence or something far more disturbing. When Matthew arrived at the gallery the next morning, Catherine had the paintings arranged in a specific order. She guided him to a chair and began asking questions about his creative process, about the sources of his inspiration, about how a blind man could paint with such precise detail. Matthew's answers were vague, almost evasive. He spoke of painting what he felt, of images that came to him in dreams, of a process he couldn't fully explain even to himself. Catherine then described the paintings one by one, not their artistic qualities, but their locations, their connections to unsolved cases. She watched Matthew's face carefully as she spoke, noting the subtle changes in his expression, the tightening around his jaw, the way his hands gripped the armrests of his chair. The question Catherine needed answered was simple yet profound. How could a blind man paint crime scenes he had never seen? And more troubling still, why did one of his paintings contain a detail from Amanda Peterson's disappearance that investigators had deliberately kept from the public, a detail known only to law enforcement and whoever had been present that night? As Catherine finished speaking, Matthew Collins sat in silence, his sightless eyes directed toward the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, carrying a weight that suggested the answer to Catherine's questions would unravel something far darker than anyone could have anticipated. April 3, 2018. Detective Sarah Miller had worked in the Portland Police Bureau's Major Crimes Unit for 14 years, long enough to develop instincts about which leads deserved serious attention and which would inevitably lead nowhere. When Catherine Hayes contacted the department about the paintings, Sarah's initial reaction had been skeptical. Art connecting to cold cases sounded more like the plot of a television drama than legitimate investigative work. But Catherine had been insistent, providing detailed photographs and comparisons that were difficult to dismiss. Sarah agreed to meet at the gallery, bringing along her partner, Detective Christopher Wade, a methodical investigator known for his thoroughness in document analysis. What they saw that Tuesday morning changed their perspective entirely. The paintings lined the gallery walls like a haunting exhibition of Portland's darkest moments. Sarah recognized the alley where Amanda Peterson had vanished in 2015, the warehouse connected to Jessica Martinez's disappearance in 2016, the residential street near where Nicole Andrews had last been seen in 2017. 3 separate cases, 3 different locations, all captured with unsettling precision by an artist who claimed he couldn't see. Matthew Collins arrived at the gallery within an hour of the detective's call. He moved through the space with the practiced navigation of someone who had learned to map environments through memory and sound. Sarah noted his cooperation, the way he answered questions without demanding a lawyer be present, though she also observed the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands as he explained his artistic process. Matthew had worked as an archival specialist at Wilson & Associates, a mid-sized law firm in downtown Portland, for nearly 20 years before losing his vision. His job had involved organizing case files, digitizing old records, maintaining the firm's extensive document storage system. It was detailed, meticulous work that suited his naturally orderly mind and his exceptional memory. The memory was what people who knew Matthew always mentioned first. Even before his blindness, he had possessed what psychologists call hyperthymesia, or highly superior autobiographical memory. He could recall specific dates, conversations, visual details from years past with remarkable accuracy. Colleagues at the law firm had often joked that Matthew was a walking filing cabinet, able to locate obscure documents and remember case details that others had long forgotten. Sarah and Christopher spent 3 days interviewing people connected to Matthew's past. Co-workers from Wilson & Associates described him as quiet, reliable, someone who kept to himself, but was always helpful when needed. His supervisor, Elizabeth Morgan, mentioned that Matthew had seemed different in the months before he lost his vision, more withdrawn, occasionally distracted in ways that were uncharacteristic. The detectives also spoke with Matthew's ophthalmologist, Dr. Richard Foster, who had examined him extensively after his vision loss. The medical records showed no physical damage to Matthew's eyes, no detectable neurological cause for his blindness. Dr. Foster had eventually classified it as a rare case of conversion disorder, sometimes called psychogenic blindness, where psychological trauma manifests as physical symptoms without organic cause. What connected all 3 victims, Amanda Peterson, Jessica Martinez, and Nicole Andrews, became clear through careful investigation. All three had worked at different times as independent contractors for Wilson and Associates. Amanda had been a forensic accountant hired to review financial records for a corporate fraud case. Jessica had worked as a private investigator, gathering evidence for a complex civil lawsuit. Nicole had been a paralegal brought in during a particularly demanding trial preparation period. The law firm's senior partner, Robert Chen, had built Wilson and Associates from a small practice into a respected firm handling high-stakes corporate litigation and criminal defense. The firm's client list included several prominent Portland businesses, real estate developers, and individuals with significant financial resources. On the surface, Wilson and Associates appeared successful and legitimate, but Sarah's investigation began uncovering irregularities. Financial records from the firm showed unusual patterns: large deposits from shell companies, transfers to offshore accounts, payments that didn't correspond to documented cases or clients. The firm's bookkeeping became increasingly opaque the deeper Sarah and Christopher dug. Multiple accountants had been hired and dismissed over the years, each stint lasting only months before they departed, often abruptly. Sarah obtained a warrant to examine Wilson and Associates' archived files, the same documents Matthew had once organized and maintained. What they found suggested a sophisticated money laundering operation disguised within legitimate legal work. Cases that existed primarily on paper, clients whose identities couldn't be verified, fee structures that made little sense for the services supposedly provided. Amanda Peterson had been reviewing these same financial records when she disappeared. Jessica Martinez had been investigating connections between Wilson and Associates and several clients suspected of fraud. Nicole Andrews had stumbled upon irregularities while organizing trial documents, discrepancies between official records and actual case proceedings. The timeline was damning. Each woman had made her discovery, reported concerns to Robert Chen or other senior partners, and then vanished within weeks. No bodies had been found, no witnesses had come forward, and investigations had stalled without evidence of foul play. Until a blind man's paintings had provided a roadmap to locations that law enforcement had never connected to the disappearances. Matthew's paintings included details that troubled Sarah deeply. The warehouse painting showed not just the general space, but specific elements: a particular pattern of water stains on the concrete floor, the exact positioning of support columns, the type of industrial fixtures mounted on the walls. When Sarah and Christopher visited the actual warehouse, they confirmed these details matched precisely. The same held true for the other locations: accuracy that transcended artistic interpretation and suggested direct knowledge. During their fourth interview with Matthew, Sarah asked him directly about his presence at Wilson and Associates during the periods when each woman had disappeared. Matthew's answers were careful, measured. He acknowledged working late hours, often being in the office when others had left. He confirmed knowing about the financial irregularities, though he claimed ignorance about the full scope of what was happening. What Matthew couldn't adequately explain was how he continued to paint with such precision after losing his vision. He spoke of muscle memory, of a process that felt more intuitive than deliberate, of images that came to him complete and fully formed. He described dreams where he could see again, dreams so vivid they felt like memories rather than unconscious fabrications. Sarah consulted with Dr. Angela Martinez, a neuropsychologist specializing in trauma and memory. Dr. Martinez explained that psychogenic blindness often resulted from witnessing something so traumatic that the brain essentially shut down visual processing as a protective mechanism. The person's eyes functioned normally, but the psychological trauma prevented the brain from interpreting visual signals. In some cases, memories from before the traumatic event remained exceptionally vivid, accessible in ways that allowed detailed recall even without current vision. The question that haunted Sarah as the investigation progressed was what exactly Matthew Collins had witnessed that caused his mind to shut down his vision, and more pressingly, whether his paintings were the work of a witness trying to reveal the truth, or something far more sinister, the artistic confessions of someone involved in the disappearances themselves. The answer to that question, Sarah would soon discover, lay buried in a night 5 years ago, a night that Matthew had never spoken about to anyone, a night that had shattered his world and left him living in permanent darkness, unable to face what his eyes had seen. May 17, 2018. The investigation into Matthew Collins and Wilson and Associates had expanded beyond what Detective Sarah Miller initially anticipated. What began as questions about unusual paintings had evolved into a comprehensive examination of a law firm's decade-long operations, financial transactions, and the disturbing pattern connecting 3 missing women to the same organization. The detectives obtained full access to Wilson and Associates' premises through a series of warrants. Christopher Wade spent days photographing documents, copying hard drives, interviewing current and former employees. The firm's senior partner, Robert Chen, cooperated with apparent openness, providing access to files and records while maintaining that his firm had nothing to hide. His demeanor was professional, almost unnervingly calm, the behavior of someone either genuinely innocent or supremely confident in covering his tracks. Sarah focused her attention on the timeline of events surrounding each disappearance. Amanda Peterson had last been seen leaving the Wilson and Associates building at approximately 9:30 on the evening of March 12, 2015. Security footage showed her exiting through the main entrance, her laptop bag over her shoulder, her expression troubled. She never arrived home. Her car was found 2 days later in the parking structure adjacent to the building, keys still in the ignition. Jessica Martinez had disappeared on August 3, 2016, after spending an afternoon at the firm reviewing case files. Unlike Amanda, Jessica hadn't been working late. She had left at her usual time, 5:15 in the afternoon, but security cameras showed something unusual. She had returned to the building at 7:45 that evening, using her temporary access card to enter through a side entrance. She was never seen leaving. Her belongings were later found in a conference room, her investigation notes conspicuously absent. Nicole Andrews had vanished on November 29, 2017, during what should have been an ordinary workday. She had arrived at the firm at 8 in the morning, attended meetings, worked at her desk. Sometime between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, she had simply disappeared from the building. Co-workers assumed she had stepped out for an appointment, but she never returned. Her purse remained in her desk drawer, her phone eventually found in a restroom on the building's 3rd floor. The security footage from these dates became crucial evidence, but not for what it showed. What troubled Sarah most was what had been erased. In each case, significant gaps appeared in the recorded footage during critical timeframes. Technical experts examined the security system and confirmed that the deletions were deliberate, executed by someone with administrative access to the surveillance network. Matthew Collins had possessed such access. His role as archival specialist included responsibility for maintaining the firm's digital systems, including security footage archives. When confronted with this information, Matthew didn't deny his access capabilities. Instead, he provided a detail that shifted the investigation's focus. Robert Chen also had full administrative privileges, as did 3 other senior members of the firm. The detectives began examining Robert Chen's background more thoroughly. His path to establishing Wilson and Associates revealed a history of working for firms that had eventually faced regulatory scrutiny. 2 previous employers had been investigated for financial irregularities, though charges were never filed. Associates who had worked with Chen in earlier positions described him as brilliant but ruthless, someone who pushed ethical boundaries in pursuit of client interests and financial success. Financial forensics experts working with the Portland Police Bureau uncovered a sophisticated network of shell companies and offshore accounts connected to Wilson and Associates. Money moved through these entities in patterns designed to obscure its origins and destinations. Client funds mingled with unexplained deposits, then dispersed through channels that became increasingly difficult to trace. Amanda Peterson's final report, recovered from her cloud backup storage, documented her concerns about these financial structures. She had identified approximately $3 million in transactions that couldn't be reconciled with legitimate casework. Her notes indicated plans to present her findings to Robert Chen, followed by a decision to contact authorities if the discrepancies weren't adequately explained. Jessica Martinez's investigation files, partially recovered from her encrypted backup drive, showed she had been documenting connections between Wilson and Associates clients and known criminal enterprises. She had photographed meetings between Robert Chen and individuals with documented ties to organized crime, real estate fraud, and money laundering operations. Her last file entry, dated the day she disappeared, noted a plan to confront Chen with evidence of the firm's involvement in illegal activities. Nicole Andrews had been more cautious. She had confided her concerns to a friend outside the firm, expressing fear about what she had discovered in case files she was organizing. The friend reported that Nicole had found discrepancies between official court filings and internal documents, evidence that the firm was potentially fabricating evidence and submitting false testimony in criminal cases. Nicole had been gathering proof, planning to report the misconduct through proper channels. Sarah arranged for Matthew Collins to be brought in for another formal interview, this time at the police station rather than in casual settings. The neuropsychologist, Dr. Angela Martinez, was present to observe and assess Matthew's responses and psychological state. Sarah needed to understand the full scope of what Matthew knew about the firm's operations and his potential involvement. Matthew's account of his time at Wilson and Associates revealed a man who had witnessed more than he acknowledged. He described a culture of secrecy, of files kept separate from official records, of conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. As an archival specialist, he had seen documents that troubled him, financial records that didn't match case descriptions, correspondence that suggested activities far beyond legitimate legal work. But Matthew insisted he had never questioned what he saw, never reported his concerns, never confronted anyone at the firm. He had simply done his job, filed the documents, maintained the systems, and tried not to think too deeply about the implications of what passed through his hands. The critical question remained: what had Matthew witnessed that caused his psychogenic blindness? Dr. Martinez explained that the timing of his vision loss corresponded exactly with Amanda Peterson's disappearance. Within 3 days of that March evening in 2015, Matthew had begun experiencing visual disturbances. Within 2 weeks, he was completely blind, his brain having shut down visual processing in response to profound psychological trauma. Sarah pressed Matthew about that specific night, March 12, 2015. His responses became evasive, his breathing quickened, signs of stress that Dr. Martinez noted carefully. Matthew claimed he had left the office at his usual time, around 6 in the evening. But security logs showed his access card had been used to enter the building at 8:45 that night, just before the security footage began showing its first gaps. The evidence was accumulating, pointing toward a night 5 years ago when something happened in the Wilson and Associates building, something involving Amanda Peterson, something that Matthew Collins had witnessed. Whether he had been a passive observer or an active participant remained unclear, but his painting suggested his mind was trying to reveal what his conscious memory refused to acknowledge. As the interview concluded, Sarah made a decision. She would confront Matthew with the security records, with the timeline that contradicted his account, with the evidence that placed him in the building during the critical hours of Amanda Peterson's disappearance. But first, she needed to understand more about Robert Chen's movements that same night, because the security logs revealed something else that hadn't been apparent in earlier reviews. Robert Chen's access card had been used to enter the building at 8:37, just 8 minutes before Matthew's entry, and neither man's card had been used to exit until the following morning. Whatever had happened that night had involved both men, and the truth about Amanda Peterson's fate and possibly the fates of Jessica Martinez and Nicole Andrews was buried in those missing hours. Matthew's paintings were a map leading toward that truth, but Sarah understood now that extracting the full story would require breaking through layers of trauma, denial, and possibly calculated deception that had protected these secrets for 5 years. The question was no longer whether Matthew Collins knew what had happened. The question was whether he had tried to stop it, or whether his blindness was the price of complicity, his mind's punishment for silence in the face of something his conscience couldn't bear to witness. Portland, Oregon, June 8, 2018. The pressure of the investigation had been mounting steadily on Matthew Collins. Detective Sarah Miller had presented him with the security evidence, the timeline that contradicted his earlier statements, the undeniable proof that he had been present in the Wilson and Associates building during critical hours on the night Amanda Peterson disappeared. Faced with this documentation, Matthew's carefully constructed explanations began to crumble. Dr. Angela Martinez, the neuropsychologist, worked with Matthew over several sessions, using specialized techniques to help him access traumatic memories that his mind had suppressed. The process was delicate, requiring trust and patience, but gradually, Matthew began revealing fragments of that March evening in 2015, pieces of a night that his psyche had worked desperately to erase. Matthew had indeed left the office at his usual time that evening, but he had forgotten his personal laptop in his desk drawer. The laptop contained family photographs, personal documents, items unrelated to work, but valuable to him. He had realized the oversight when he arrived home and had driven back to the office, arriving at approximately 8:45. The building had seemed empty, most lights turned off, the usual after-hours quietness pervading the space. He had taken the elevator to the third floor where his workstation was located, retrieved his laptop, and was preparing to leave when he heard sounds from the hallway near the senior partner's offices. Voices raised in anger, the sharp tone of confrontation. Matthew had hesitated, uncertain whether to investigate or simply leave. The sounds had grown more heated, and concern had overridden his instinct to avoid involvement. Moving quietly down the hallway, Matthew had seen light spilling from Robert Chen's office. The door was partially open, and through the gap, he could see Amanda Peterson standing near Chen's desk, her posture defensive, her voice carrying an edge of fear and defiance. She was holding a folder, documents visible inside, and she was demanding explanations for the financial irregularities she had discovered. Robert Chen's response had been measured at first, attempting to rationalize the discrepancies as accounting complexities that Amanda had misunderstood. But Amanda had been persistent, insisting the evidence showed deliberate fraud, money laundering, the systematic theft of client funds. She had threatened to report her findings to authorities, to expose Wilson and Associates for what it truly was beneath its respectable facade. Matthew had watched as the confrontation escalated, as Chen's controlled demeanor shifted to barely contained rage. The senior partner had moved around his desk, his movements predatory, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. Amanda had backed toward the door, trying to maintain distance, her earlier confidence visibly wavering in the face of Chen's intimidation. What happened next had unfolded with terrible speed. Chen had grabbed Amanda's arm as she attempted to leave, yanking her back into the office with shocking violence. The folder fell to the floor, documents scattering. Amanda had tried to pull away, to reach for her phone, to call for help. The struggle had been brief but intense, and Matthew, frozen in the hallway, paralyzed by shock and fear, had simply watched through the partially open door. Chen had overpowered Amanda, his hands around her throat, her attempts to fight weakening as oxygen was denied to her brain. Matthew had stood motionless, his body refusing to respond to his mind's commands to intervene, to help, to stop what was happening. The entire terrible sequence had lasted perhaps 3 minutes, though to Matthew it had felt both instantaneous and eternal. When Amanda's body went limp, Chen had released her, letting her collapse to the floor. He had stood over her motionless form, breathing heavily, his expression a mixture of rage and calculation. Then Chen had looked up and seen Matthew standing in the hallway, visible through the office door gap, his face surely reflecting the horror of what he had just witnessed. The two men had stared at each other for a moment that Matthew would later describe as the point where his world fractured. Chen had not threatened him directly, had not moved toward him aggressively. Instead, the senior partner had simply asked a question that carried more weight than any explicit threat. He had asked Matthew whether he understood what happened to people who couldn't keep important information confidential, who betrayed the trust of those who had given them good employment and treated them well over the years. Matthew had nodded, his voice lost, his legs barely supporting him. Chen had told him to leave, to go home, to forget what he had seen, to understand that Amanda's fate would be his own if he ever spoke about this night to anyone. Matthew had fled, his hands shaking so violently he could barely drive. his mind already beginning the process of denial and suppression that would eventually manifest as complete blindness. In the days and weeks that followed, Matthew had existed in a state of psychological collapse. He had watched news reports about Amanda's disappearance, had seen her family's desperate pleas for information, had observed the police investigation proceed without any meaningful leads. His guilt had been overwhelming, crushing, a weight that grew heavier each day that he maintained his silence. His vision had begun deteriorating within 72 hours of that night. First, peripheral darkness, then spreading blind spots, then complete loss of sight. Medical examinations found no physical cause, but Matthew understood the truth. His eyes had seen something his conscience couldn't bear, and his mind had responded by shutting down his ability to see anything at all. The subsequent disappearances of Jessica Martinez and Nicole Andrews had followed similar patterns, though Matthew had not witnessed those events directly. He had heard whispers in the office, noticed Chen's increased paranoia and control, observed the careful manipulation of security systems and records. He had understood that other women who had discovered the firm's secrets were being eliminated, and his continued silence made him complicit in their fates. Matthew's paintings had emerged as his psyche's attempt to reveal what his voice couldn't speak. Working in darkness, his exceptional memory provided the visual details, his hands translating remembered images onto canvas. The paintings were confessions, maps, desperate attempts by his subconscious mind to provide the truth that fear and guilt prevented him from stating directly. Sarah Miller now possessed the full account of Amanda Peterson's death and Matthew's role as a witness who had failed to intervene or report the crime. The challenge facing the investigation was transforming Matthew's testimony into evidence that could lead to Robert Chen's prosecution. Chen had covered his tracks carefully, eliminating physical evidence, manipulating records, ensuring that no direct connection could be established between himself and the missing women. But Matthew's paintings provided something unprecedented in criminal investigation. His exceptional memory, combined with the specific details captured in his art, offered a roadmap to locations and evidence that Chen believed were safely hidden. If the paintings showed where Amanda had died, they might also reveal where her body had been concealed, and potentially where Jessica and Nicole had been taken as well. Sarah assembled a team to examine each painting in forensic detail, comparing the depicted locations to known properties associated with Wilson and Associates, Chen's personal holdings, and businesses connected to the firm's client network. The warehouse painting drew particular attention, matching a property that Wilson and Associates had managed briefly in 2015, during the exact period of Amanda's disappearance, before the building was sold to a development company. Search warrants were obtained, and forensic teams prepared to examine locations that Matthew's art had revealed. The paintings had become more than artistic expression. They were testimony, evidence, and potentially the key to finding 3 women who had been missing for years, whose families had never stopped searching, whose fates had been buried beneath layers of corruption and calculated violence. As the investigation moved toward its critical phase, one question remained unanswered. Matthew had witnessed Amanda Peterson's death and had remained silent, his fear and guilt manifesting as blindness, his paintings a form of confession his conscious mind couldn't articulate. But would his testimony, combined with whatever evidence forensic searches might uncover, be sufficient to hold Robert Chen accountable for crimes he had committed with such careful planning and ruthless efficiency? The answer to that question would determine whether justice could finally reach across 5 years of silence, or whether Chen's calculated approach to eliminating threats would prove more powerful than one witness's traumatic memories and artistic revelations. Portland, Oregon, July 22, 2018. The forensic investigation of locations depicted in Matthew Collins' paintings represented one of the most unusual evidence-gathering operations in Portland Police Bureau history. Detective Sarah Miller coordinated teams of specialists, including forensic anthropologists, crime scene technicians, and cadaver detection units, to systematically examine sites that a blind man's art had revealed. The warehouse painting had led investigators to a property on the industrial eastern edge of Portland, a structure that Wilson and Associates had briefly controlled through a complex series of holding companies in 2015. The building had changed ownership twice since then, currently standing vacant and scheduled for demolition to make way for new development. Sarah obtained access through emergency court orders, citing the urgency of a potential crime scene investigation. Forensic teams entered the warehouse on a gray morning, their equipment cases and detection tools creating an odd contrast against the building's abandoned interior. Cadaver dogs were brought in first, trained animals capable of detecting human remains even years after death. Within 20 minutes of beginning their search, 2 dogs alerted to the same location, a section of concrete floor in the building's northwest corner, precisely where Matthew's painting had shown a particular pattern of structural support columns. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed anomalies beneath the concrete, areas where the subsurface density differed from surrounding sections. Forensic engineers marked the locations and careful excavation began. The concrete layer was removed in sections, revealing disturbed earth beneath. 3 feet down, the team uncovered the first evidence, fabric fragments consistent with professional office attire, degraded by time but still identifiable. Further excavation revealed human remains, skeletal elements that forensic anthropologists carefully documented and removed for laboratory analysis. The position and preservation of the remains suggested burial shortly after death. The concrete poured above, serving as both concealment and barrier against detection. Personal effects found with the remains, including jewelry and dental work, would later confirm the identity as Amanda Peterson. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Matthew's painting had been accurate not merely in depicting the warehouse's appearance, but in identifying the precise location where evidence had been concealed. The implications were profound. If one painting had led to finding Amanda, the other paintings might similarly reveal the locations where Jessica Martinez and Nicole Andrews had been hidden. Sarah immediately ordered searches of 2 additional locations. The first corresponded to Matthew's painting of a residential street, which investigators had identified as matching a property in the suburb of Beaverton. Records showed the house had been owned by a shell company that Wilson and Associates had used for various business purposes. The property had been sold in late 2016, shortly after Jessica Martinez's disappearance. The second location was more challenging. Matthew's painting showed what appeared to be a wooded area, trees surrounding a small clearing, details that could correspond to thousands of locations in the heavily forested regions surrounding Portland. But Matthew, working with forensic artists and Dr. Angela Martinez through careful psychological techniques, created additional paintings that provided more specific details. A particular configuration of trees, a slope angle, a distant view of mountains through the canopy. Geographic analysts compared these details against topographical maps and satellite imagery of areas connected to Robert Chen's known activities. A match emerged with property in the Cascade foothills, land that Chen personally owned through a trust designated as investment property held for potential future development. Forensic teams executed searches of both locations simultaneously. At the Beaverton house, ground-penetrating radar detected anomalies in the backyard, beneath what had once been a garden area. Excavation revealed remains that would later be identified through dental records as Jessica Martinez, buried in a manner similar to Amanda Peterson, concealed and deliberately hidden beneath landscaping that had been altered after her disappearance. The forested property required more extensive searching, but cadaver dogs eventually alerted to a location approximately 200 yards from the main access road. The grave was deeper here, better hidden, but forensic anthropologists recovered remains that dental records would confirm belonged to Nicole Andrews. The level of planning evident in the concealment suggested Chen had been refining his methods, learning from each crime how to better hide evidence of his actions. With 3 bodies recovered, Sarah Miller had the physical evidence needed to pursue prosecution. But the case still faced significant challenges. Direct evidence connecting Robert Chen to the deaths remained circumstantial. Matthew Collins' testimony would be crucial, but defense attorneys would attack his credibility, emphasizing his blindness, his failure to report the crime initially, his potential motives for fabricating accusations. The prosecution team, led by Deputy District Attorney Lisa Anderson, began building their case with meticulous attention to detail. Financial forensics experts documented the money laundering operations that had motivated the murders. Each victim had discovered aspects of the fraud and had been eliminated to protect the scheme. Digital forensics teams recovered deleted emails and messages from Wilson and Associates servers, communications that showed Chen's growing paranoia about exposure. Security footage gaps were analyzed by technical experts who testified that the deletions required administrative access and technical knowledge, capabilities that Chen possessed. The timing of deletions corresponded precisely to the periods when each woman had disappeared, evidence of deliberate destruction of potential documentation. Matthew's paintings became central exhibits, analyzed by art forensics experts who testified about the extraordinary accuracy of details depicted. Neuropsychologists explained psychogenic blindness and traumatic memory, helping juries understand how Matthew could paint scenes with such precision despite his current inability to see. Robert Chen was arrested on July 30, 2018, charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of financial fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. His arraignment drew significant media attention, the case having captured public imagination through its unusual circumstances. A blind witness whose paintings had revealed hidden graves, a respected attorney revealed as a murderer, a law firm used as cover for organized criminal activity. Chen maintained his innocence, his defense team arguing that the evidence was circumstantial, that Matthew Collins was an unreliable witness with potential psychological problems, that the connections between Chen and the burial locations could be explained through legitimate business activities. The strategy was predictable but potentially effective, creating reasonable doubt by attacking the prosecution's most vulnerable elements. The trial preparation consumed months, both sides marshalling expert witnesses, preparing exhibits, crafting narratives that would present their versions of events to a jury. Sarah Miller worked closely with prosecutors, ensuring every piece of evidence was documented and defended, every potential weakness in their case addressed before defense attorneys could exploit it. Matthew Collins underwent extensive preparation for his testimony, working with prosecutors and Dr. Martinez to ensure he could present his account clearly and withstand cross-examination. The psychological toll was immense, forcing Matthew to relive trauma he had spent 5 years trying to suppress, to acknowledge his failure to intervene when Amanda Peterson needed help, to accept his complicity through silence in the subsequent deaths of Jessica Martinez and Nicole Andrews. But Matthew also began experiencing something unexpected during this process. His vision, absent for 5 years, started showing signs of returning. First, vague awareness of light and shadow, then gradually increasing ability to perceive shapes and movement. Dr. Richard Foster, his ophthalmologist, documented the improvement with amazement, noting that as Matthew confronted his trauma and took steps toward accountability, his psychogenic blindness was reversing. The medical phenomenon provided additional validation of Matthew's account, evidence that his condition had indeed been psychologically rooted, that facing the truth was literally allowing him to see again. Prosecutors recognized the powerful symbolism this would present to a jury, the blind man regaining sight as he emerged from years of traumatic silence. As the trial date approached, both sides understood the stakes extended beyond Robert Chen's fate. The case would test whether complex forensic evidence, psychological testimony, and unusual circumstantial connections could overcome defense strategies that emphasized reasonable doubt and witness credibility challenges. 3 families waited for justice, their loved ones finally found, but their killer still potentially beyond legal reach. Matthew Collins waited to learn whether his testimony and his paintings would be sufficient to hold accountable the man whose violence had shattered multiple lives, or whether his years of silence had allowed too much time to pass, too much evidence to disappear, too many alternative explanations to emerge that might let Robert Chen escape the consequences of his calculated brutality. Portland, Oregon, September 4, 2018. The trial of Robert Chen began in Multnomah County Circuit Court, drawing unprecedented public and media attention. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity, with overflow crowds gathering outside, following proceedings through news reports and social media updates. Judge Patricia Morrison presided over the case, her reputation for maintaining strict courtroom decorum and ensuring fair proceedings, giving both prosecution and defense confidence in the trial's integrity. Deputy District Attorney Lisa Anderson opened with a methodical presentation of the evidence, walking the jury through the timeline of events, the financial crimes that had motivated the murders, the systematic elimination of witnesses who had discovered Wilson and Associates' fraudulent operations. Her approach was deliberate and detailed, building a comprehensive picture of Robert Chen as a man who had used his legal expertise and professional position to commit and conceal serious crimes. The prosecution called dozens of witnesses over 3 weeks of testimony. Financial experts explained the money laundering schemes, demonstrating how millions of dollars had moved through shell companies and offshore accounts. Former Wilson and Associates employees testified about the firm's culture of secrecy, about documents they were told to destroy, about questions they were instructed never to ask. Forensic anthropologists presented evidence about the 3 victims' remains, their burial locations, the deliberate concealment that had kept them hidden for years. Crime scene technicians walked the jury through the excavations, the careful documentation of evidence, the process of identifying victims through dental records and personal effects. Matthew Collins took the stand on the trial's 15th day. His testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case, the moment when the jury would hear directly from the man whose paintings had unlocked the investigation. Matthew's vision had continued improving, though he still struggled with details and relied on thick corrective lenses. His ability to make eye contact with jurors as he testified carried powerful impact. Matthew recounted the events of March 12, 2015, describing in careful detail what he had witnessed through the partially open door of Robert Chen's office. He acknowledged his failure to intervene, his cowardice in remaining silent, the psychological breakdown that had manifested as blindness. His testimony was raw and honest, admitting his moral failures while clearly establishing what he had seen. The defense cross-examination was aggressive as expected. Chen's attorneys attacked Matthew's credibility, emphasizing his 5-year delay in coming forward, questioning whether blindness could truly be psychologically induced, suggesting his paintings might have been created with assistance from others who had fed him information. They portrayed Matthew as a troubled individual seeking attention and perhaps attempting to deflect blame for crimes he himself might have been involved in. But the prosecution's rebuttal was effective. Dr. Angela Martinez testified extensively about psychogenic blindness, presenting medical literature and case studies demonstrating the condition's legitimacy. She explained Matthew's exceptional memory, his ability to recall visual details with extraordinary accuracy, how his paintings represented his mind's attempt to reveal suppressed traumatic memories. Dr. Richard Foster corroborated the diagnosis, presenting medical records documenting Matthew's condition and recent vision improvement. He testified that the timing of Matthew's vision loss and recovery aligned perfectly with psychological trauma and resolution, supporting rather than undermining his credibility. The paintings themselves were presented as exhibits, analyzed by experts who testified about the extraordinary accuracy of details depicted. Forensic teams confirmed that Matthew's art had led them to precise locations where remains were found, details he couldn't have known through any means other than direct observation or involvement. The prosecution argued convincingly that Matthew's role had been as a traumatized witness, not a participant. His paintings, the work of a conscience struggling to reveal truth his fear had kept buried. Security evidence proved critical in connecting Robert Chen to the crimes. Digital forensics experts testified about deleted surveillance footage, demonstrating that the deletions required Chen's administrative access and had occurred during timeframes corresponding to each disappearance. Phone records placed Chen at or near burial locations during periods when victims were likely transported and concealed. The financial motive was established through testimony from investigators who had traced the money laundering operations. Each victim had been eliminated at moments when they posed existential threats to the criminal enterprise Chen had built within Wilson and Associates. The pattern was clear and damning, showing systematic elimination of witnesses who had discovered evidence of fraud. Chen's defense rested on creating reasonable doubt, arguing that circumstantial evidence wasn't sufficient for conviction beyond reasonable doubt. They presented character witnesses who described Chen as a dedicated attorney and community member. They suggested alternative explanations for evidence, proposing that others at Wilson and Associates might have been responsible, that Matthew Collins's testimony was unreliable, that the burial location's connections to Chen could be coincidental. But the cumulative weight of evidence proved overwhelming. The prosecution's closing argument tied together financial records, security footage, forensic evidence, and Matthew's testimony into a coherent narrative that left little room for alternative explanations. 3 women had discovered Chen's crimes, and 3 women had been murdered to protect those secrets. The evidence established opportunity, motive, and method with compelling clarity. The jury deliberated for 4 days before reaching their verdict. On September 28, 2018, they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts. 3 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of financial fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. Robert Chen showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, his expression remaining controlled even as his carefully constructed defense collapsed. Sentencing occurred 6 weeks later. Judge Morrison imposed 3 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole for the murder convictions, ensuring Chen would spend the remainder of his life in prison. Additional sentences for financial crimes were added consecutively, eliminating any possibility of appeal or reduced sentencing providing early release. The families of Amanda Peterson, Jessica Martinez, and Nicole Andrews finally received the closure and justice they had sought for years. Each family provided victim impact statements during sentencing, describing the devastation of losing their loved ones, the agony of years without answers, the relief of finally knowing the truth and seeing accountability imposed. Matthew Collins also addressed the court during sentencing, expressing remorse for his silence, acknowledging the harm caused by his failure to act when intervention might have saved subsequent victims. He announced the establishment of a foundation using proceeds from selling his paintings, an organization dedicated to supporting witnesses of crimes who suffered psychological trauma, helping them find courage to come forward and resources to heal. The Wilson and Associates law firm was dissolved, its assets seized to compensate victims and settle financial fraud claims. Several other attorneys and staff members faced charges for their roles in the money laundering operations, though none were connected to the murders. The case prompted reforms in legal profession oversight, increased attention to financial monitoring of law firms, and greater awareness of how professional positions could be exploited for criminal purposes. Matthew's vision continued improving through therapy and treatment, though doctors predicted he would never regain full clarity. But the partial restoration of sight felt miraculous to him, a physical manifestation of psychological healing that came from finally speaking truth he had suppressed for years. The case became studied in law schools, psychology programs, and forensic science courses as an example of how unusual evidence could solve seemingly impossible crimes. Matthew's paintings were eventually exhibited in museums, not as art, but as artifacts of criminal justice, visual testimony that had helped bring a murderer to justice. For Sarah Miller and the investigative team, the case represented both professional triumph and sobering reminder of how easily crimes can remain hidden when perpetrators possess intelligence, resources, and willingness to eliminate threats. The investigation had succeeded because Matthew Collins' exceptional memory and artistic ability had provided a unique form of evidence, but it highlighted how many other crimes might never be solved because witnesses lack similar capabilities or courage to come forward. The 3 women whose discoveries had cost them their lives were finally properly buried, their families able to grieve and remember them as the brave individuals who had tried to expose corruption and hold wrongdoers accountable. Their deaths had not been in vain. The truth had eventually emerged, justice had been served, and Robert Chen would spend the rest of his life facing consequences for his calculated brutality. In the end, the case demonstrated fundamental truths about justice and accountability. That truth can remain buried, but not destroyed. That conscience can find ways to speak even through years of traumatic silence. That the pursuit of justice requires courage from witnesses, persistence from investigators, and commitment from communities to ensure that power and position provide no immunity from consequences. Matthew Collins had lived in darkness for 5 years, but his willingness to finally face what his eyes had seen brought light to crimes that might otherwise have remained forever hidden, allowing 3 families to find peace and ensuring that one man's violence could no longer destroy innocent lives with impunity.